It is my pleasure to welcome Professor David Flint to the show. David, lovely to see you.
And I'm delighted to be on, and lovely to see you, Alexandra.
Well, before we get to your article, which drops with the magazine tonight, I wanted to ask you a quick question about former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. You wrote about him last week saying, and I quote, "Along with national leaders of the standing of John Howard and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, Tony would not have shamed the nation by slapping a foreign dictator with a wet lettuce for his clear acts of aggression as Anthony Albanese did recently," end quote. Now, I noticed from the comments left by Spectator readers that there is a growing nostalgia for Mr Abbott and indeed the era of stately politicians. Do you think we are headed for another generation of Thatchers and Reagans and Churchills? And if so, have you seen any potential Australian statesmen rising through the ranks?
Well, I do hope so, and there are some young ones. For example, the soldier, Mr Hastie, for example, or Angus Taylor, and Mr Canavan, Senator Canavan, they are all strong personalities, and I'm sure they would not tolerate what happened before. And I think that the likely advent of President Trump for another term in the White House will set the scene for strength in the West, I would think.
Yes, well, also Abbott had a look about him and a way of moving that we're just not seeing with people like Albanese, which are a little bit embarrassing to watch Albanese stumble across the world stage. But this topic links into your article, which is out tonight, where you ask, and I quote, "Is Dutton now prime ministerial material?" Now, in my view, Dutton's moment was during the Turnbull, spill when Morrison was manoeuvred into power. I think he would have made a better prime minister at that point in time. Although, to be fair, I think you were comparing him with Albanese. So, do you think that Dutton is pulling ahead of Albanese following the budget?
Well, I think he is, and the latest poll, the Morgan poll, says it's too close to call. Now, the reason why it's too close to call, the reason why Labour is still doing very well is a vast segment of the mainstream media is very, very inclined towards Labour, and no matter what Labour does, they will be tolerated very gently. For example, the recent acquisition of 2 aircraft for the fleet that the Prime Minister and the senior ministers uses. If a Liberal had done that, it would have been in the news for days and days. If Tony Abbott, for example, had taken a referendum of the country, spent almost $500 million at least, as much as we know, and lost that referendum so spectacularly, the media would have had much to say about that. But of course, they wanted the referendum to go through, most of them, and they were dissatisfied with the result too, so they decided to do what they normally do with something embarrassing for the Labour Party. They just ignore it. They pretend it didn't happen.
You're so right. They have pretended that just didn't happen. But you also made an interesting point in your article, although it's somewhat of a political paradox, I have to admit, that the harder the major parties, Labor and Liberal, chase this green net zero vote, the more unpopular they become. And, God love the World Socialist website. They ran the headline, "Australian Labor Party records the lowest primary vote since 1934, with Labor winning around, just a hair above 30% of the primary vote, making it the worst result since the Great Depression. Now, most of the vote has been flowing to things like the Greens, or particularly the Teals, which are blue ribbon Liberals dripped in green politics. Now, I'm going to also quote the Socialists here because, for once, they actually have a point. They said, "These independents," that being the Teals, with substantial financial backing and themselves closely connected to the corporate elite, promote the lie that climate change can be reversed through green investment, the real purpose of which is to develop new profit opportunities for big business." So, David, is the Teal vote a one-hit wonder, or will Dutton have to grapple with it in the next election?
I think they're going out of fashion. They had tremendous support from the media. For example, the program on Sky, the Sunday morning program Outsiders, that was interrupted. It stopped early one Sunday to everyone's surprise, and Sky went out to the Domain to film the beginning of a campaign by a complete unknown, the young lady who took over Mr. Abbott's seat. Now, that was an extraordinary gesture towards a person who claimed to be an independent, who had no influence at all. How often do you stop a major program, a current affairs program, and go and film the opening of a nobody's campaign? They gave enormous support to the Teals because they wanted to reduce the influence of conservative liberals. But I agree with you. I think they are very much a single-purpose party. They are a party. They're a single-purpose party, and they're there to do the bidding of those who finance them in relation to the renewables. And I think they're now out of fashion. Australians have realised that renewables are not the cheapest form of energy. They realise it's very expensive, notwithstanding the CSIRO's attempt to stop nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is cheaper than the renewables if they operate alone. The renewables, as you know, require support. They've got to have some form of electricity when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and that makes renewables very expensive, which we're seeing today in Australia. And we know that this is having a devastating effect on the remaining industry we have, because a lot of manufacturers, including such vital manufacturers as Mars bars and people like that, they're all warning the government that electricity prices are far too high in Australia, and they'll obviously have to leave Australia.
Well, it's worse than that, David, because the Teals in particular built their narrative around renewable energy being virtuous. It was about being a saviour complex, using green energy as their mechanism to get to some kind of random Teal heaven. But they can't be virtuous with bits of rare bird falling at their feet. I mean, it is not cracked all it's been cracked up to be. And so a lot of those people are stepping away going, you know what, maybe it's not such a good idea. But you made the following point. I'm going to quote you here. It seems that the future Labor Party support base will consist of a rump of working from home public servants, assorted, well-educated, wealthy virtue signallers, and those who have abandoned work for the endless dole or other modes of generous lifelong support by taxpayers. Now, David, this isn't only a comment about Labor voters. For the first time in many centuries, we are seeing the voting social groups inside a democracy change. We no longer have huge amounts of people, working manual labour in the factories or the farmlands. We've got a brand new class of young influencers who make their money from online fame and international brand contracts. There's also overeducated, debt-ridden university students with little real-world experience being held back from the workforce by their political attitudes. Now, this means that for Labor and Liberal, they can't appeal to their traditional voting bases. What kind of impact do you think this is going to have on elections in the West in the future, including Australia?
Well, I think we're seeing it in the United States, where, for example, a significant increase in the number of blacks and of Latin Americans who are voting for the Republicans. I think the Latin Americans are now coming up equal to the Democrat vote. And among the blacks, there's a very significant increase, particularly among young men. And they're all realizing that the Democrats, notwithstanding all they say about their loyalty towards those communities, what they are doing is working against their interests. And I think Australians too are realizing that what used to be called the working class, and they are, for example, people in the construction industries and so on, they realise that, and also in mining, they realise that the Labor Party is working against them. For example, coal miners, people who are working in gas and so on, realise that the Labor Party is against fossil fuel and therefore will take away their jobs. Now, obviously, those people will move away from those parties. I think the Liberal Party, and particularly the Nationals, will become the party of those people. And this will cause changes in the makeup. I suspect that once President Trump comes in and declares that global warming is a hoax, there'll be a general wake-up to this fact. It'll be like the tale about the emperor who was wearing no clothes and the little child who said, says everybody pretends he's wearing clothes because he's been conned by a couple of fraudsters like renewable people, and he's been conned into believing that only those who are unintelligent cannot see his clothes. The little child says, "Why is the emperor wearing no clothes?" Well, I think President Trump will be the little child in the world, and he'll be saying, "Why are we following this hoax, which is really only enriching the communists in China and those who are investing in renewables?"
It almost sounds as if you're describing a new era of the Menzies forgotten people coming up in Australia. That is, if the Liberal Party are smart enough to do away with their net zero ambitions and embrace all the destitute people who really are looking for a new leader. And that includes the middle class, who are becoming poorer and poorer at the moment in this cost of living crisis. But unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for joining us here today on Spectator TV.
Certainly. Thank you.